Well, hi everyone. It's so nice to meet you all, see you all, even virtually. I can't see any of your faces, but maybe that will change throughout the presentation. But my name is Lydia. I'm the head of operations for StopTheTraffik. I'm just going to share my screen, so I'm not speaking to nothing. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, amazing. Let me just fix my screen, sorry. Okay, perfect. Okay, so yes, my name is Lydia. I'm the head of operations with StopTheTraffik. And how many of you in the room have kind of heard of StopTheTraffik, worked with us, seen me maybe before? Okay, maybe nobody. Okay, so StopTheTraffik, we are a charity that works to prevent human trafficking. So key emphasis on the word prevent. There's a lot of amazing work around detection, a lot of amazing work around rescue, which is super necessary. And we work in the field of prevention. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about organ trafficking, trafficking in persons. So this is going to be kind of the theme. Hopefully it's not too harrowing, and I promise we'll end on a positive note and hopefully all feel empowered to make a difference. I'll just dive straight into it. Does anyone have any questions before we begin? Okay, brilliant. We'll get into it. So we're going to start with an activity, which I know is always can be a little bit daunting, but I want everyone here to imagine that you have joined a task force and your aim is to put the company Global Doble out of business. So you have intelligence that they are completely unethical. You have to come up with a plan to disrupt their operations and put them out of business. So this is the activity. You are all members of a task force responsible for putting this unethical business out of operations. So here's the brief. This is what you know. They're the second largest business in the world, and they're the fastest growing. They need to employ 6,000 people next year to sustain their operations. They make $250 million a year in turnover. They operate globally. They typically advertise themselves through social media, large-scale marketing campaigns, word of mouth. They take payment in cash, credit card, and cryptocurrency. I've already detected a typo, apologies. And they're governed by a board of 20 individuals with equal voting rights. So my question to you guys, you're the task force, how would you disrupt this business with all of this information in mind? What are some ideas that you might think, okay, this is how we're going to bring down this company based on the intelligence that I have? They're unethical. Any ideas? It doesn't have to be genius. I've heard everything from we need to take down the CEO to all kinds of wild ideas. So anything is acceptable, no wrong answers. Is anyone brave enough to come up with any ideas? If you had intelligence that, you know, say a big fast food chain in your local area was really unethical, really corrupt, what would your go-to be to disrupt them? Okay, I won't let us sit in silence too long, don't worry. So if for me, I might think about, for instance, how they're making money and how to interrupt or disrupt the ways they're receiving profits. That would be one thought that I would have. Or perhaps exposing the fact that they're unethical online, through media, perhaps through bad PR. Any ideas before I turn the slide and release us from the misery of an activity? Okay, so I'm going to cover how basically trafficking relies trafficking is basically a highly profitable, low-risk business, and it makes it a very, very, very desirable crime. So I said to you before that this company, Global, needs to employ 6,000 people next year to sustain their operations. As it stands now, the current trafficking model needs to recruit 6 million people every year to sustain the global model of human trafficking. I said to you that at the moment, Global makes 250 million a year in turnover. Current estimates from the ILO indicate that human trafficking makes 150 billion per year, and that is a conservative estimate at the moment, and is predicted to go up to 750 billion in the next report. So just for context, 750 billion per annum is 20 times what Coca-Cola makes per year. So it's also larger than it's also more than the 5 largest companies in the world combined. So it's quite a big operation, human trafficking. So trafficking relies on the recruitment of vulnerable people, as I just said. That is key to their business model. Without people, there is no trafficking, right? It also relies on the ability to place trafficked people into legitimate businesses and coerce them into forced criminality. Finally, trafficking relies on the ability to move proceeds of crime through legitimate financial systems. So as I said, trafficking is a booming business model, as was Global, and without the ability to move that profit through legitimate financial institutions, traffickers don't have a model, right? They're not making profit, they're gonna move elsewhere. Trafficking is all about making money and making profit. Does anyone have questions up till here? Okay, amazing. So I'm gonna try and put this into a bit of a picture for you all and humanize this bit, because it's really easy to talk about trafficking in terms of numbers, in terms of profit, how many people they recruit, etc. We all need to kind of turn our attention to this. And can you see my my screen where it shows an individual saying case study Ahmed?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. Just making sure that we're all looking at the same thing. So amazing. So if we could all think about this individual called Ahmed. Ahmed is somebody that name is changed, of course, for privacy, but Ahmed is somebody that we came to contact with through one of our prevention programs. So Ahmed was being trafficked from Afghanistan to Greece. He was basically considering selling his organ and reached out to us to ask us how to sell his organ safely. We equipped him with safety information, and he eventually decided not to continue in the path of selling his organ, and we were able to connect him with other organizations to provide accommodation and access to legal immigration status, helping him eventually obtain a job, place to live, and safety. So when we encountered him, he was homeless. His legal case had been rejected twice, and now he is with safe accommodation, with safe immigration status, and with a place to live, and decided not to sell his organ to a human trafficker. More than that, we were able to speak with him, communicate, and eventually share data with one another. And Ahmed was able to provide information of the bank account where he would have transferred the proceeds, where the human trafficker would have transferred the proceeds of the crime of selling his organ. He was able to share what social media accounts were relevant in this transaction. So where he was hearing about this opportunity to sell his organ, who was communicating with him through which social media accounts, where the money would have been transferred, and how the money would have been transferred, and more information around the process by which he would have sold his organ. So with this data, we can build financial flows and really disrupt this process. This just kind of goes to show you how much information one person has, and how powerful that information can be if we share that information with others. So imagine with that information around the social media accounts, we're able to disrupt the recruitment of more people into selling their organs. With the information about the bank account, we're able to disrupt the financial flow where that trafficker would have made profit. Further, we found out more granular information. For instance, that the boxes where organs are transported in are in very high demand and in low supply. So we're able to work with the suppliers of those boxes to be incredibly specific about who they supply to. So I want everyone to Ahmed is one person. I want everyone to kind of imagine that there are thousands of Ahmeds out there in vulnerable situations like this who are looking to sell their organs because they're in situations of vulnerability. and that by equipping these people with safety information, access to safer routes, they may be able to find more legitimate options for safety, and also share the information they have in order to keep future people safe. Does anyone have any questions about this case? I realize that was a little bit of a complicated story, but hopefully you kind of grasp how complex these cases can be. Okay, I'm going to move on. So today, of course, we're going to be talking about the organ trade. I won't be showing any distressing imagery, but our brains are wonderful things that want to protect us and can respond without even seeing images. So please do engage as much as you want to with this presentation, and do leave if you need to, if anything we say today is overwhelming. And my email is on the screen if you want to contact me after the session about anything that we speak about today. Okay, so I'm going to cover with you the history of organ transplants. And I don't want this to be, again, too harrowing. It's actually really amazing. So in 1954 was the world's first successful organ transplant. It was the transplant of a kidney. In 1980, we had the organ transplantation considered non-experimental medicine. Then in 1990, accounts of organ selling and buying occur across this decade, but are not taken very seriously. In 2007, you had 65,000 patients waiting in the EU waiting for a kidney transplant. In the US, 120,000 are waiting, and 10,500 donors are registered. The WHO estimates that 5 to 10% of all transplants are conducted illegally. So I just want to pause there between 1954 and 2007. Organ transplants are a very new piece of medicine, right? It's kind of amazing. Only in 1954 did we realize that we had this medical ability. And that's how quickly the organ trade, the illegal organ trade, adapted to that model and became a mechanism for profit. So it's quite an interesting piece of history, and really tells us a lot about how fast trafficking can adapt. In 2011, it's estimated that the illicit organ trade generated between 600 million USD and 1.2 billion per year. 2013, the UNODC collect data on global trafficking and find 100 cases of trafficking in persons for organ removal from 20 countries. And in 2015, they recorded 1,200 cases from 90 countries. So when we're talking about organ transplants, we are typically talking about the kidney and the liver. There have been other cases, but those are the cases that we most typically see. Does anyone have any questions about kind of the history here? And if anyone wants to go into something in more detail, feel free to contact me afterwards. I also think I see there's a chat. Oh, great. People are talking in the chat. I only just saw the notifications now. Oh, thanks, guys. And feel free to also speak up. So if I don't see you in the chat, it's just because it's hard to see it between sharing your screen. Amazing. So I'm going to walk you through a country profile. I wish I had time to find a different country, but this is actually some of the richest data that we have is in the US. So there are currently 121,000 people waiting for life-saving organ transplants in the US. Of these, 100,000 await kidney transplants. The median wait time for an individual's first kidney transplant is 3.6 years. In 2014, 17,000 kidney transplants took place in the US. Of these, 11,000 came from deceased donors and 5,000 came from living donors. On average, over 3,000 new patients are added to the kidney waiting list each month. 13 people die every day while waiting for a life-saving kidney transplant, and every 14 minutes, someone is added to the kidney transplant list. I want to pause here because, and it might sound really, really gruesome to say, but if you're a trafficker, this is a really high demand for a product, is what part of what I'm trying to get across here. These numbers are really staggering. Every time I read them, I kind of can't believe how many people are in need of an organ and how many people die waiting. And from the perspective of a trafficker looking to make profit, these numbers are really good for you, essentially. So I want to kind of walk you through the changing landscape of vulnerability, especially amidst COVID. So probably in lots of presentations, that we're all seeing, COVID really tends to make an appearance, and that's because it really changed people's level of vulnerability. So you just heard all of these statistics about people already needing organs, and people looking to sell organs in situations of vulnerability. COVID changed this all over because you have an increased amount of people out of work. You have an increased amount of people not being able to travel, find alternate, safer situations. Their choice is reduced. When you're potentially out of work, you could potentially be out of accommodation. You guys probably know all of this very well. Very simply, COVID has increased a lot of people's vulnerability, and especially those who are already vulnerable. So you can see some headlines here. COVID-19, a perfect storm for organ trafficking victims. Organ trafficking in Egypt, they locked me in and they took my kidney. This is another thing to kind of pause and talk about. Forced removal of organs is very common in cases, right? So especially with COVID, where you might not be able to travel, you don't have anywhere else to go, it might have been easier to target people who were unable to transit. So COVID basically, really changed the landscape that we already knew was quite poor. So again, the demand for organs, especially kidneys, is going up. Those with circumstances that make them vulnerable to exploitation, supply, going up. The potential profits that could be made in the illegal organ trade, going up. Again, if you are a trafficker, this is a gold situation for you. And it sounds horrible to say and to talk about that way, but it's the reality. You have more and more people needing organs. You have more and more people willing to sell your organs, and therefore your profits are likely to rise and your model is strong. So obviously this is a serious problem. Pause again because I'm realizing that agents comments around here. Okay, feel free to jump in whenever. I'm just gonna have a sip of water. Amazing. So definitions. Any presentation would be at a loss without going through some good definitions. I'll be honest, these slides are the hardest to kind of create. Oh, we've got somebody in the chat, I'll just check. Is there any way to track where the organ recipients get their surgeries? So great question, and we'll get into a little bit of this later. Like all trafficking, trafficking's hidden in plain sight. It's always around us in different ways that we can't always see. Organ trafficking is no different, and in many ways it's worse. It's very, very hard to get good data on. It's of course illegal, and it's very much hard to identify when it occurs, let alone get details. That's why that story about Ahmed, when he gives you all of those details, is so incredible, because it's so rare. However, there are numerous survivor stories. So we work with an expert called Sean Collum, who's a real leader in this field. And there's lots of reports and survivor stories that we've kind of pulled together, and we've found that organ recipients basically, sorry, let me go back to the chat to make sure I answer your question. They get their surgeries a few different ways. They often can get them through legitimate doctors who are within the organ trade network, but there are legitimate medical professionals who perform the operations. So that's one way, if the professional is in tie with the organ trafficking network. Then other people perform the operations who are not medical professionals and who are not trained. This is, of course, very dangerous and can lead to even worse long-term health effects. And it's also, there have been accounts of forced organ removal, and this is basically what it sounds like. So the scale, there is a scale. It can be performed well by a medical professional, and it can be performed extremely dangerously in a forced manner. Does that answer your question? Okay, there's a chat. Yes, okay, great. All right, so on to definitions. Trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal. There's two definitions I'm going to cover today, and I'll kind of walk you through the legislative difference. So according to the Trafficking in Persons Protocol, the offense involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer and harboring or receipt of persons, through threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments of benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person, for the purpose of exploitation through the removal of organs. So just to be clear, the definition of trafficking has to include act, means, and exploitation. And here the exploitation has to be for the purpose of removal of organs. According to the Council of Europe, Convention Against Trafficking in Human Beings, organ trafficking covers a range of illicit practices: removal of organs without free, informed, and specific consent, removal of organs for financial gain or comparable advantage, implantation or other use of illicitly removed organs, preparation, preservation, storage, transportation, transfer, receipt, import, and export of such illicitly removed organs, illicit solicitation or recruitment of organ donors or recipients, offering and requesting of undue advantages to or by healthcare professionals or officials with the view to performing or facilitating such removal or implantation and other use, attempting to commit or aiding or embedding the commission of any of these criminal acts. So these are two different definitions. They are similar, but basically it's really important here to understand that in both definitions, depending on what your essentially country jurisdiction adopts, the best piece of evidence for an incident of illicit organ trafficking is the person whose organ was removed. They are essentially a walking piece of evidence. They have a lack of the organ in their body, they have a scar to indicate this, and many of you are probably familiar with the legal landscape for various situations, and it's not uncommon for the victim of a situation to be the one that's prosecuted. And in the case of organ trafficking, that's no different. Victims are often prosecuted as a person whose organ was removed, and it's much harder to prosecute the person who is responsible for removing that organ. So that's a serious risk here to be aware of, and really poses a risk to the person who is a victim of this crime and doesn't necessarily have the ability to defend themselves in a court of law. Any questions here around legislation? To be honest, this as I said before, these slides were kind of the most difficult to come up with because legislation around organ trafficking is quite complicated, and it's not the easiest terrain to navigate. So if you do want to talk about legislation more after this, you can come to me, and we have an expert in the team that I can introduce you to. Okay, move on. Amazing. This is kind of what I was just going over, but the definitions are distinct but overlapping. So both definitions, just to be clear, would find it illegal if absent consent is found. This is a vague area from a legal perspective, and consent may be invoked as a defense strategy, as a way of shifting focus from the perpetrator's behavior to that of the victim. So the framework against this happening is much clearer in the trafficking in persons for organ removal, as the presence of means revokes all question of consent. Does anyone need a break, a pause, any questions? I'm aware that it's quite a heavy topic, so I'll probably keep asking that just to check in. Okay, so we're going to move into how organ trafficking happens. So, tactics used by traffickers. In the last couple of slides, I said to you that organ trafficking and selling your organ is illegal, right? Just because it's illegal doesn't stop people from doing it. If that was the case, you know, the world would be rid of lots and lots of problems, right? So traffickers are smart, and they use a variety of tactics to recruit individuals. So this is a quote from the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. Victims in this form of trafficking are often extremely economically or socially vulnerable groups and may have no realistic alternative than submitted to the exploitation. It is common, however, that the abuse of a position of vulnerability is used by traffickers in conjunction with the other means, especially deception and fraud, whereby, for example, the seriousness of the medical procedure or its health effects in the aftermath are downplayed to the potential victim, and or false promises of high financial gains are made. So breaking this down, basically articulating that victims of organ trafficking are among the most vulnerable groups of our society. Traffickers use deception and fraud. And so, for instance, I'll go into this later, but one of the most common myths, I suppose, is that there are no side effects or long-term health effects after, giving away your organ. This is untrue. There are health effects, but traffickers will, of course, deceive people into thinking there are not, and therefore they'll think the sale of their organ is safe. So organs can be taken in a number of ways. A victim can formally or informally agree to sell their organ. This is then cheated because they are not paid for the organ or are paid less than the promised price. I'm going to pause here because a lot of victims, to be clear, are paid when they sell their organ to a trafficker. But put yourself in the shoes of a trafficker. And across this presentation, I really do want you to imagine that you are the trafficker here, because if you do that, you'll see basically what a good business model this is and why it's such a problem. For the trafficker, after they've removed your organ, whether they've done this forcibly or they've gotten a medical professional to do it, once they've removed your organ, why would they pay you? They have what they need. They're not going to put it back in your body. And what's in it for them to then give you the money after that surgery? So imagine this entire time you are the trafficker and think about it from that perspective. So oftentimes victims are paid. Most of the time they are paid less than they were promised, or they're not paid at all. There's a book, and I've forgotten the exact title, but it's by Sean Collum, and he cites a lot of survivor stories of organ trafficking. And one story really sticks with me, and we'll go over some stories in a few slides, but basically this individual was taken to an apartment to sell her organ. They took really nice care of her. They took her to the medical professional. They removed her organ. They took her back to the apartment to recover from the surgery. And she went to bed, resting on the couch after the surgery. And when she woke up, they had taken the money that they had given her and her passport. So she woke up without the organ, without the payment, and additionally without her passport. So she was a vulnerable person targeted to sell her organ, and she woke up from the surgery in a significantly more vulnerable situation than she was in before. Ailments. A person is treated for an ailment which may or may not exist, and the organs are removed without the victim's knowledge. That's another way organ trafficking happens. And extortion. A victim may be held against their will and their organs removed without their consent. So as you can see, there is a scale of basically force used by traffickers. Recruitment tactics. People might hear of an acquaintance or member of their community that's selling an organ as an easy way to make money. That person is usually a part of the organ trafficking network. So spreading the word about selling your organ, selling your kidney is an easy way to make money, and that person is likely doing this intentionally as part of the organ trade network. Gangs and brokers involved with organ trafficking exchange information about people. Their targets are people they know are experiencing difficulties, as they will likely be more open to persuasion. They often pay people from the target's own community to convince them to sell an organ. Brokers will try and convince the potential seller to go through with the procedure after a period of persistent solicitation. This is something that we've really found to be true throughout our work, throughout our prevention program against organ trafficking, that traffickers do tend to be quite persistent. Another story from the same book by Sean Collum cited an example of a woman working in a cafe, and the community knew she was in quite a vulnerable situation. She had children that she couldn't provide for, etc. And two people from the organ trafficking network visited that cafe almost on a daily basis until she eventually agreed to sell her organ. That is how persistent the brokers are, and for a person in a vulnerable situation, that is obviously a very difficult situation to be into and to say no to. Hibba, a woman who was convinced to sell her kidney, described how the traffickers were relentless in their pursuit. They don't give you time to think about what you want to do. They keep asking you, reassuring you. They say it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. This is good for you and your family. They introduced me to some guy who had already sold his kidney. They wanted me to see that he was happy. He said that he was okay and that it was safe. He did not look okay. So, as I said before about Ahmed, there are hundreds of these people around the world, if not thousands. I'm going to go over some commonly asked questions by those vulnerable to this crime. This is information that we've gained through working with different partners, through focus groups, and I think this is kind of information that is harder to Google is really gained directly from survivor stories, and it really tells us a lot about the space and the mindset that these people are in, and the kind of questions that they're considering in the process of deciding whether or not to sell their organ. Any questions up until this point before I dive in? So one common question that people ask is it safe? So the operations that organ sellers have are extremely dangerous procedures, to be clear. Some organ sellers die during surgeries. There are often reports of a lack of preoperative care, such as x-rays, blood tests, and anesthesiastic pre-assessments. There are also reported cases of a lack of testing for things such as undiagnosed cancers or hepatitis that can be a risk to the seller and the recipient. So even if it seems doctors are present, some of the people performing the surgery might not be qualified medical professionals. So as I said to you, it's a scale. Sometimes it's a qualified doctor performing the surgery, and sometimes it's not a medical professional at all, even if they're wearing scrubs or something to indicate they are, to make the individual feel safe. So the answer is no, it's not safe, but this is a common misconception around the procedures. Will I experience long-term health problems? When I think about this, I really kind of understand this question. I'm not sure I would necessarily, the medical field is a very large and complicated field, and you hear about people giving their organ to someone, or being on the transplant list, etc. And it's quite understandable to think that potentially you wouldn't have long-term health problems, but some people may be willing to take that risk to their health, and the sale rarely leads to long-term economic benefits, and often the experience does lead to a decline in health, and these people are unable to work again. So this is a quote from an organ seller. After my kidney was taken, I cannot work or sleep well. There are many things I cannot do right now. Sellers can also experience anemia and blood clots. So this is a long list of health problems reported by organ sellers. And I think this especially occurs when the operation isn't performed correctly, which is typically the case. But sellers can experience chronic fatigue, kidney disease, disability, breathing problems, depression, anxiety, abdominal pain, diabetes, and wound infections. So if you imagine you're a vulnerable person and you're looking for support, and someone approaches you persistently and repeatedly to sell your organ, you eventually give in, you sell your organ looking for the economic benefit. And in the end, you end up worse off, unable to work, even more vulnerable than the situation you were in before as a result of these health problems. Will I be paid? So in most reported cases, the sellers experience the following: significantly less payment than agreed, no payment received for the organ, full payment received but stolen soon afterwards, full payment received but spent within 3 to 5 months, agreement to trade an organ for onward travel via smuggling is false. So as you can see, people were not experiencing a long-term economic benefit they were hoping to from this sale. It would be the outlier to receive full payment and good care. So even if payment is received, the seller risks information being shared with criminal networks, which can put them in danger. A market vendor in Cairo recounted a story of a Sudanese woman who was murdered by a group of men he described as the mafia. I don't know if this woman was promising anything for her kidney, but days after she had the operation, some people came into her house, took all her money, and killed her. This mafia, they don't care what happens to you after they have your kidney. Market seller. People will ask, can I change my mind after agreeing to the surgery? Many people who change their mind about the procedure endured threats and intimidation from brokers. This is something a lot of our data and research found, that initially traffickers will be persistent. They'll ask you if you want to sell your organ over and over until you agree. Once you agree, it's very, very, very hard to remove your consent. And if you do, you will likely endure more violent and intimidating and aggressive tactics from the trafficker. Brokers are motivated by financial gain. They're unscrupulous and will resort to threats, violence, and whatever they want, whatever it takes to get what they want. So when asked about this in an interview, a broker replied, they cannot change their mind. This isn't an option. Once they agree, it's done. One of the organ sellers said, they told me that they would never let me change my mind. They said, if you change your mind, you will pay for all the health checks and we will never leave you alone. We will take all your money and your passport. We'll never let you go. So once you say yes, even if you go home that night, have a conversation about it with a friend, a family member. You decide it's unsafe, you go back the next day, say no, and you may be victim to more violence. I'll pause again for questions. Feel free to pop them in the chat or speak up. You can always interrupt me at any point. So this is a case study of Omar. 27-year-old Omar was living in Khartoum when he was offered work in Cairo, an offer which transpired to be false. Omar was forced to repay the middleman the supposed high cost involving in arranging his travel documents and passport. After threats and violence, the gang told Omar he could sell his kidney to repay the debt. Following the procedure, Omar was paid and taken to the apartment for recovery. When he went to sleep, the gang took everything, his money, his passport, and the papers from the operation. This is similar to a story I told you earlier. I think I forgot this exact case study was here, but this one really impacts me when I read it. I think because, you know, we all have this idea like of falling asleep and feeling safe. And the fact that when you wake up, your vulnerability has increased so drastically is such a scary thing to really think about. Hibba, a single mother with 2 children, was relentlessly pursued for months by brokers until she eventually relented and agreed to sell her kidney. When she arrived at the clinic, one of the medical staff informed Hibba that she would receive £40,000. That's about 2,500. Oh, that can't be right. That's about 2,500 USD, significantly less than 40,000 USD that she had been promised. Hibba did not accept this, and she refused to go through with the procedure. However, she was prevented from leaving the hospital. The doctor gave Hibba an anesthetic, and the kidney was removed. The broker gave her about $2,500 and asked her to leave. She spent most of the money staying at the hotel that night. Dawit was 16 years old when an acquaintance suggested he sell a kidney in Cairo. He was offered $5,000 for the surgery and would use the money to fund onward travel to Europe. After surgery, Dawit was taken to an apartment for recovery and received an envelope with $2,000. The broker promised to pay the remaining $3,000 once he had recovered from the surgery. Instead, the broker paid a smuggler who would facilitate Dawit's journey to Italy. The broker connected Dawit to the smuggler with no assurances as to when or if the boat would depart. When Dawit recovered and felt strong enough to make the journey, the broker and the smuggler disappeared. Dawit was left with nothing. I could feel the regret hitting me. I sat down crying, thinking about how I sacrificed everything and have nothing to show for it. They got away with my money and my kidney. Is everyone okay? Are people still with me? I know these are, we've got 2 people in the chat. I'm just going to check this. What's the line between the person becoming, this might have been from before, sorry. What's the line between the person becoming victims and criminal? What evidence might support them in case of persecution? Good question. So I'm just thinking about this. So personally, I'm not the expert on legislation, so I'll do my best to answer this. And if you want to talk more after, definitely come to us because we do have an expert on the team. So as I said before, it's very, very hard to prosecute the person responsible for removing someone's kidney or trafficking someone's kidney. You would need to prove a wide range of things. You need to prove the intent, the means. There need to be evidence surrounding that activity that took place. As I said, the person whose organ was removed is the best piece of evidence. Everything else is quite hard to uncover. And that's what makes prosecution so hard. So in terms of the best pieces of evidence, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving you a 100% answer on that. So what I would say is send me an email, let me connect you to the expert on our team so we can give you a proper case. But that's a really good question, and legislation in this field is very, very complicated, so I don't want to do it any injustices. So apologies for that, but thank you so much for your question, and definitely do email me afterwards, or I can get your email in the chat. So what next? We're moving into recommendations and prevention and action. So I don't want you to feel like we're just going to cover these stories and kind of, you know, feel like there's nothing we can do, because there are real things that we can do to make change. So I'm not going to read all of these out, but these are from the UNODC 2015 report, Prevention Recommendations for Organ Trafficking. All I would say here is that these are actually really, really good. A couple of them, raising awareness of the crime of trafficking for organ removal. What you're all doing here today, joining this presentation, listening to this, if you all go away from this presentation and you know a little bit more about organ trafficking, we've made a big difference here today. Even more than that, if you all leave this presentation and you have a conversation with one other person, and maybe they have a conversation with one other person, again, we have made a big difference together. I'm sure that maybe some of you have had a similar experience, but when you talk about trafficking, people have a real conception in their head of what that looks like. In my experience, it typically relates to sex trafficking. Organ trafficking is something that I often hear people go, oh, organ trafficking, I've never heard of that. And raising awareness in this space is so, so important. So a big thank you to everybody here. Clarity around definitions is super important. So getting a legal, this is kind of why I can't answer the question in the chat as well as I would love to. That was from Angela, because legislation and definitions and the legal framework around this issue is really, really tough. It's not clear, and it's not, it's not the same across countries, and we don't have one internationally accepted definition. I'm sure you guys know this is an issue for lots of different crimes, but that would be another good place to start. Measures that address root causes such as poverty, underdevelopment, lack of equal opportunity. As we've said, organ trafficking targets the most vulnerable people of our society. Pulling people out of those vulnerable situations and empowering them with safer conditions is critical to preventing this crime. So let you guys have a review of those later. There is a real need for data here. So this is a quote that says, "The scarcity of evidence-based data on trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal can result in a lack of knowledge about the modus operandi of criminal networks, experience of organ sellers, buyers, and doctors, the criminal involvement of transplant professionals, the collusion and corruption within hospitals, possible manipulation of medical insurers, etc. Allowing organized crime networks to continue organ-related crimes with impunity, however, allows the threat of victimization of the world's poorest and most vulnerable to increase." So another reason that earlier in the chat, somebody said, is there data on the ways that most organs receive, the ways that most organ sellers receive their procedures? It's another hard question for me to answer, because I can tell you what stories we've heard out of working with partner organizations, experts, focus groups, but I can't tell you, oh, there's this, amazing pool of data, and yes, 70% of people sell an organ this way, and 30% of people sell an organ this way, and that is because we have a fundamental lack of data in the human trafficking space generally, and especially when it comes to something as hidden and illicit as organ trafficking. So back to the story of Ahmed. I'll get to this in a second. I told you that Ahmed is somebody that we came into contact with through our prevention campaign, targeting those people vulnerable to organ trafficking with safety information. So Ahmed, when we approached that case and we grew to support him and eventually get him into a safer condition, the quantity of information that he held, as I said before, around financial flows, around social media, around the process of how he would have sold his organ if he had chosen to engage, around the boxes that organs were transported in. That is such rich data that we receive from one person. Right now, everybody is holding pieces of the puzzle, and we need to fit those pieces together in a coordinated, efficient way if we are going to hope to prevent this crime going forward. We, Stop the Traffic, are not going to stop organ trafficking. We can't do it by ourselves. It would be an amazing thing if I could sit here and say, we're going to stop organ trafficking, and this is how, and here's my presentation. It doesn't work that way. We need to work together. All of you being here is amazing. Raising awareness, learning about the issue. The next step is, do we have information about organ trafficking that each one of us is holding a little piece of the puzzle that we can bring together? Because when we do, the power of that data is incredible. What you see here is a heat map in our database, which is called the Traffic Analysis Hub. So StopTheTraffik, together in partnership with IBM, founded Traffic Analysis Hub, which is the world's largest database on human trafficking. So our CEO kind of famously says, probably on a daily basis, if we can't see it, we can't stop it. If we don't know what's going on, if we don't know what routes people are being trafficked on, if we don't know what financial flows trafficking is taking place, how people are selling their organs, what traffickers are doing with that money, what traffickers are doing with their business model, I could go on and on. There's just no way that we could disrupt this crime, right? So when we put data together, as you can see here, when we identify routes, when we identify hotspots, when we identify trends, we can act on it, right? We can take that data and we can run a prevention program using that bespoke information to target the most vulnerable people in our society and equip them with information that will keep them safe. So basically, data into action. This also refers to our Stop app, which is the way that everyone, individuals, organizations, frontline workers, can report suspicions of human trafficking into an app at your fingertips. This is basically everyone's best friend, right? My best friend, your best friend, and it's the best friend of vulnerable people around the world. So with our prevention programs, you'll get an ad on your Facebook that pops up every day, and it's giving you information about safety information about selling your organ and how to perhaps access safer routes and safer options for a job or accommodation or support locally in your area, giving people alternative options rather than selling their organ. Similarly, this can also give people the power to report when they see red flags of human trafficking, when they spot a potential victim, when they spot a potential perpetrator, but it's not yet to the threshold to call law enforcement. It gives them a space to report that suspicion and know that somebody is taking that data and putting it together with a massive database and figuring out what we can do with that intelligence together in a coordinated way. So be a part of the response is basically my ask today. So do you have stories about organ trafficking or know about routes, hotspots, or details, how and where it's happening? If you do, request a demo of the Traffic Analysis Hub to find out how you can share these stories into this database and know that change will be taken with this data and intelligence in mind. Do you know someone who has experienced the organ trade and wants to safely and anonymously share their story? Tell them about the Stop app. Tell them there's a way to anonymously share your story and report what's happened to you, and know that somebody is going to take that data and use it to empower other people so they're not in the same situation that you were unfortunately in. Want to know more about this issue that's happening and keep it on the global agenda? Keep reading, sharing, and talking. So you guys are doing this by being here today in this presentation, by learning about organ trafficking, and hopefully sharing this information with some of your colleagues, friends, family members, although I know it's not the most fun topic to bring up at the dinner table, it's a very important one. So I want to kind of bring this all together to say, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So we've covered so many harrowing stories today, and organ trafficking is something that I never thought I would know so much about. I, a few years ago didn't know it existed, and it can feel very easy to spiral and just feel like it's such an overwhelming crime, and how could we impact it? As this quote says, small groups of committed citizens are the only thing in this world that have really made impactful change. You guys are capable of working together to prevent this crime, and I promise you that you would be amazed by if we all shared one piece of data and put it together. We would surprise ourselves with the quantity of intelligence that we have right here in this room, and the ability we have to make other people safer with those intelligence or with those insights. So that's my presentation today. I will stop sharing my screen just so I can see everyone, because otherwise it can be a bit hard not to see you all. That was so much information. It's one of my first times giving a presentation to so many people on this topic. I'm sure there must be questions. So does anyone have any comments, or how did this kind of resonate with you all? Okay, no comments or questions. Thanks. So someone said thanks for the presentation. Thank you so much. All right, well, if no one has any comments or concerns, as I said, my email is on the screen. I'm just going to pop it in the chat, lydia.defelice@stopthetraffic.org. If you have any kind of feedback, something you want to learn more about, if you want a demo of the hub, if you just want to chat more about organ trafficking or ask questions, please give me an email. Really happy to speak to any of you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and present on this topic. And hopefully you have a good rest of your day, and it's not as overwhelming perhaps as talking about the organ trade. All right. Thank you guys. Thanks so much.